Welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of master classes in public policy. Our presenter today is Martha Njolomole, who is an economist at Center of the American Experiment. Martha is from Malawi in East Africa. She came to the United States at age 16 and began studying economics. She received her master's degree in economics last June and has been with the center since October. Today, she's going to be talking about regulation, the pros and cons of regulation, and how ubiquitous it is in our everyday lives. You can ask a question or make a comment at any time. If you hover over the bottom bar in your Zoom window, you'll see the word chat, and if you click on that, a chat box will come up. There's a setting. You can choose who you want to address your question or comment to. If you say presenters and all attendees or something like that, then everybody can see it, or you can just send it to Martha and to me. I may toss a few questions to Martha as we go through, or she goes through the presentation. And in addition, there should be some time at the end just for Q&A. So you'll have another opportunity then to ask any questions that you may want to ask. So with that, Martha, take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, John, for that introduction. So as John has mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about regulation, specifically how it affects our life. So to start with, I'm going to discuss why regulation is important, why we tend to focus on it. So as everything else we do focus on in economics, we tend to focus on things that affect economic growth. So regulation is one of the biggest ways that state and federal governments affect economic growth. So the key way that regulation affects economic growth is through affecting the key variables for growth. So as you can see here, I have the production function, which basically equates output to as a function of capital and labor. And the A there is for our total productivity, which just basically measures how efficient we're using our capital and labor. So basically what regulation does, it affects either A, which is total factor productivity, or capital or labor. So if you have any sort of regulation that prevents companies from hiring people, or prevent people from actively seeking employment or starting doing self-employment, you're going to have fewer people working in your economy. So if that sort of thing happens, and if your labor productivity remains unchanged, chances are you're going to have fewer output in the long run. Something with if you have companies investing less in their operations, buying fewer physical equipment, you're going to have fewer capital per employee working. In the same way, you're going to have lower output in the long run. But the most harmful way through which regulation affects economic growth is by affecting total factor productivity. So as I have mentioned before, total factor productivity is basically anything that makes companies produce more efficiently. So this is always attributed to technology. Technological changes makes us people produce more output per hour than before. So if you have any kind of regulations that pretty much prevent our businesses from innovating, from being more efficient, you're going to have your long run growth pretty much permanently changed, either for the better, for worse. But if you have regulations that are incentivizing businesses to invest, then you're going to have your total factor productivity pretty much raised in the long run, which pretty much increases your rate of growth there. So I do have
Martha, can I just pause you for just a moment to go back to that last slide? I think most of us have got a pretty good idea what labor is and what capital is. I didn't really know about total factor productivity until recently, when I spent a lot of time with the economists at the center. And basically total factor productivity is everything that makes labor and capital more productive, right? So a lot of times you can think of that in terms of innovation. Is that correct, you think?
Yes, that is definitely correct. So everything that makes a person produce much much faster. For instance, if maybe McDonald's bought this machine that's making one person produce like 20 burgers per hour instead of 10, that is definitely an increase in factor productivity. So that's basically along the lines there. You can have factor productivity increased by pretty much allowing firms to be more free in research, innovating, and just their production methods, just to for them to try out different methods of production, really.
Hey, Martha, we got another question real quick here. Somebody wants to know, what's the F in that formula? The F just stands for function, I think, right?
Function, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I have this graph here that's showing how much our economy has lost due to regulation. So the McCarter Center, this is a research center at the George Mason University. They did a study whereby they estimated how much regulation has affected our economy. So between the years of 1980 and 2012, we had regulation slowing our growth by at least 0.8%, which translated to our economy being $4 trillion less than it would have been if we hadn't had all those regulations, which basically translates to each American individual losing $13,000, which is quite a lot of money. And for a family of four, this basically means you're losing $50,000, which could have helped in raising your living standards, pretty much so. Now, so most of this loss usually comes because, and you're preventing businesses from innovating, from producing more productive technologies. You're preventing people from spending their time doing productive work, and you're preventing people from investing. So when all this adds up, it kind of creates this drag that makes you grow at a lower rate than you would if you didn't have all these factors impeding you in your processes. So not to say that all regulations are bad. Regulations are there basically to protect us. Regulations are pretty much intended to protect customers, the environment, workers, and businesses, just to mention a few things. So a few examples of regulations that are there to protect customers could be advertising regulation, just anything that prevents deceitful advertising. Could be packaging standards, just anything that prevents businesses from taking advantage of customers in any way. Regulations that are there to protect the environment include waste disposal rules, pollution abatement rules, just anything that is there to make sure that anything that is going to be harmful to the environment is done at its most minimal level. Then we have regulations that are there to protect workers, so anything that has to do with minimum wage, worker safety, and just fair treatment in the workplace. Any kind of those rules are there to protect workers. And when it comes to businesses, we have regulations that are there to protect maybe intellectual property rights, patent landmarks, anything like that is there to make sure that businesses do tend to keep what they own, and they get to profit on their environments and all sorts of stuff. So, but the bad thing that comes with regulation is that we have these unintended consequences that usually come because we have regulations which we do not need, or our regulations have not been properly structured. So a good example of regulation that tend to restrict supply and raise prices is the minimum wage. I think we've seen this especially with restaurants in the Twin Cities. After the $15 minimum wage was announced, we saw a lot of restaurants going out of business, and some of them had to actually raise their prices because their cost of operation was going up. So this was one of the unintended consequences of requiring businesses to pay higher than what they could afford. And another way that regulation affects supply and raise prices is through if they are not properly designed. So there's a couple of regulations that actually incentivize producers to use less efficient methods. I think renewable energy is one of the good examples of these. So for example, in Minnesota, we have all these laws that mandate that energy producers make a certain percentage of their production be renewable. So when you have those mandates and then you add subsidies to those mandates, you incentivize these energy producers to increase their production of energy with renewable resources like wind and solar, most of which are very expensive to energy consumers. But because you have all these subsidies that make it profitable for them to produce using those methods, then you tend to see more of that behavior. You tend to see those companies lobbying to get more renewable energy mandates passed, just so they could profit from those subsidies. And a good example of one of the regulations that also ended up raising prices was the corn ethanol mandate in 2005. So basically what the government did was just require that a certain percentage of energy or biofuel energy being produced should be from corn. So this pretty much raised the demand for corn in the country, and it ended up raising prices for corn and just for any type of food that is made from corn in any way. And I've mentioned most of these before. So yeah, if you're going to require companies to spend most of their time doing compliance work and not investing, you're going to have them not growing, you're going to have them not innovating, you're going to have them hire less workers than they would, which you have lost wages, and then you have lost production, and that definitely translates to lost income for everybody in the country. So one of the biggest ways through which regulation is harmful is through small businesses. Most economists do advocate against burdensome regulation because it is a huge cost to small businesses than it is to big businesses. So this is because regulations basically they affect smaller businesses much more disproportionately because they raise their costs higher for a couple of reasons. First of all, small businesses, they have a small workforce. They have small number of assets than big businesses do. So if they're required to do the same sort of compliance work, if they're required to pay the same amount of fees, they're spreading those fees over a thin margin of assets. So their costs per worker or per number of assets is very much higher when compared to big businesses. And
so Martha, one of the things that we see is that very often it's big business that will lobby for more regulations. And they always say we're doing this to protect the public. You know, we have some noble motive why we want all these regulations. But a lot of the time, I think the real reason is because they know, big business knows that it's a lot easier for them to comply with volumes and volumes of regulations than it is for small business. And what they're really trying to do is to cut off competition. Is that right, do you think?
Yes, that is definitely true. There's an incentive there for big businesses to lobby for regulation. I think we see this a lot with occupational licensing a lot, because we see a lot of established businesses trying to get legislatures to pass mandates to be licensing people who are entering those professions, just because they know that those people are going to be facing higher costs because they are not established. They don't have the capacity to handle compliance costs. They don't have the finances, which will make it much easier for them to stay in business. It's basically there just to prevent competition and prevent small businesses from growing. And the other thing is that, yeah, basically big businesses already have these departments just dedicated to looking through the books, just making sure they're doing the right reporting, they're taking the right measures and using the right standards. But small businesses usually do not have a staff dedicated to compliance. They usually have to hire maybe lawyers for a short period of time. So any changes in regulation does tend to raise those costs for them when compared to big businesses, which already have departments already set up to look into this. So a big example of regulation affecting small businesses much heavier was the Dodd-Frank Act. So the Dodd-Frank Act, the full name is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. So it was enacted in 2010, just after the financial crisis, So the reason this act was enacted was because it was there to protect customers and maintain the stability of the financial system just after things had collapsed. So what really led to the government enacting this law was the fact that there was this narrative going on that, well, big banks had been very greedy, so they had started lending to people who could not afford to have mortgages. And they didn't have a lot of regulations guiding them in their lending standards, which wasn't true, but still it led to having this law enacted in 2010. So what this law did was that it almost doubled the number of regulations that were applied to banks. If anybody has seen this act, it's at least 800 pages long. So just imagine a small bank trying to sort through all those pages. They have to hire at least one or two more people just to get through that. So what ended up happening as expected is that this act did increase compliance costs for banks, especially smaller banks, which had to hire more people. This wasn't a big deal to most big banks because, as already said, they already have these departments dedicated to doing that. The Dodd-Frank Act ended up hurting small community banks because, yeah, their costs went up, so they either had to go out of business or just curtail most of their productive lending activities, which basically just means that their financial stability is pretty much at risk too. So most banks ended up going out of business, or they had to sell to this huge business. So there was a lot of consolidation that happened with that Dodd-Frank Act. And the other thing that it did also was it curtailed small business lending. So this is because most small businesses tend to get their loans from small banks because they are much more friendlier to them than large banks are. So when you take out those small community banks, what you're doing there is preventing all these startups or these small businesses from accessing credit. That means it's a net loss to the whole economy. It's a net loss just to pretty much everyone. And the other thing that it did also increase this idea of too big to fail banks. It increased monopoly by big banks, which in itself is a big risk because these banks can now take all these risks that might lead to failure when they know that they're going to be bailed out. So
Yeah, that's one of the ironies, Martha. Just real quick, the people who voted for Dodd-Frank pretended they were voting against the idea of too big to fail. Actually, if you read the statute, it institutionalizes the concept of too big to fail. And this is one of the reasons why it's damaged the small banks, not the big banks.
Yes, definitely. So before this act was passed, there was this idea that, well, financial regulation there's been a lot of deregulation that happened in the financial sector the last couple of years before the crisis, which wasn't the case, which led to all these big banks growing and just taking all these risky businesses because they thought they could get away with it. So yes, one of the big thing about the Dodd-Frank Act was to diminish that idea of banks are too big to fail, which they certainly did not, because they ended up bailing out all these huge banks at the cost of taxpayers' money, while the small banks were just kicked to the curb, basically. So I have a graph here that's basically showing how the number of small banks decreased in size after the Dodd-Frank Act. So this is basically because they went out of businesses or they ended up being bought out. The number of large banks ended up going up because, well, they were buying out of these huge banks, and banks, also small banks, had these incentives to grow because the act had created this unfriendly environment for them. So they had to figure out ways to make themselves financially stable and stronger just to survive. So they ended up just being bought out by these large banks. So this is definitely not good news, especially to small businesses, because what we've ended up having is small businesses having no place to get loans, as I've already mentioned, because small banks are usually the best source for them to get credit. And this is another graph just showing the share of domestic deposits held by small banks. As you can see here, there was already a decrease in the number of deposits held, but when you go to 2010, the year after 2010 here, there's the decrease is much steeper, just showing you how much effect this act had on small banks, really. So I, at this point, I'm going to bring it back to Minnesota, how the state of Minnesota regulates the economy. So I think regulation is one of the harder things to talk about because it's not easy to quantify regulation. A couple of studies have tried to do that, and one of these studies is from the George Mason University. So what they do basically is they do a weight lookup on state statutes. They look up words like should, must, or can, and just count out how much all these words appear in each code of regulations. So for Minnesota, they found out that these words appear at least 98,000 times, which gives us a ranking of 14th. So compared to other states, this is a pretty good ranking because most states have at least 100,000 restrictions, with the highest ones being California and New York, which have at least 300,000 restrictions.
Hey, Martha, let me just stop you there for a second. This George Madison study, it's really interesting. You know, every state's got volumes and volumes of regulations, and they're available electronically. So these people at George Mason did a word search, like you said, and they searched for the word must or the word required or shall, you know, words like that. And they ranked the states according to how many times those words appear in their regulations. This is in my opinion, this is a really crude effort. I applaud them for trying, but I don't think that's giving you a real good sense of how impactful, you know, how damaging a state's regulatory system is just by counting the words. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree. It's very hard to know exactly because even though you might have those words, but the way they enforced also, there's a couple of other things that also matter as far as regulation is concerned. So yeah, this really just gives you a just broad picture of just how many words there are in there, which yeah, it is not a very good measure of how much burden you're imposing on people. But there's this other study by Cato, which went as far as looking at how strict you're enforcing some rules. So on that study, Minnesota ranked 28th, which is just a little above average, just giving us a picture that we don't have some laws that other states have, for example, the right to work, which basically restricts people that want to work at workplaces that have unions. If they don't want to be in a union, they cannot work there because we don't have the law in the state, which gives us a much lower ranking. And we do have we do have strict enforcement of some rules, which also kind of brings our ranking lower down. But yeah, it's very hard to know how you rank as a state in regards to regulation, because there's a couple of things that most of these studies don't measure. So for example, ambiguity in the statute of limitations can raise costs for our businesses. So for instance, you can have some laws that just goes to say, well, for instance, there's a law there that's saying businesses should abate all pollution that is excessive. For instance, who is to say what excessive means there? That means businesses are going to try to spend all this time, all this money, just looking up, just trying to figure out what this law means, if it's not exact, if it's not certain. And the other thing that raises costs for businesses is also very strict enforcement. So this is usually anything that doesn't give businesses a lot of wiggle room to figure out how to comply. So most of the examples of these renewable energy mandates or energy conservation mandates, they are very strict. They don't really allow a lot of wiggle room for houses or companies to figure out their own ways how to comply to reach all these standards. And when you have codes that are also always changing, maybe every year or every 2 years, businesses are also going to spend so much money just trying to keep up with all these rules and all these changes. So you might have businesses paying so much money for these. And the other thing is also when you have these over-changing rules, you might not be able to attract as many businesses because people are never sure if they should invest in that kind of environment. So it's a very big loss for a state to have very frequently changing regulations as well.
Martha, let me just interrupt with a quick clarification. One of our viewers asks, wouldn't you consider the restriction of right to work laws to be a good thing? I think there's a misunderstanding there. I think what you were saying is that one of the reasons why Minnesota ranks relatively low in the Cato assessment is because we don't have a right to work law. We force people to join unions, in other words. Is that right?
Yes, yes, yeah. I apologize for that inconvenience. Maybe I wasn't very clear, but yes, basically, the state of Minnesota just pretty much requires anybody that works at a workplace that has a union to be in the union and pay the dues. So, which is very much restricting to somebody who would really like to work at that place but would not afford to pay the dues or does not want to be in that union. So that's why we do rank law there. A lot of states have this right to work law, but we do not have it. So we force people to be in unions when they do not want to be. So I'm going to talk about specific industries and how they're regulated. So the first one is the liquor industry. So basically in the country, we have this three-tier distribution system. So this was started after the prohibition was repealed. So the aim of this system was basically just to make sure that there was no excessive alcohol overuse. It was just to prevent producers from just using maybe deceptive methods to entice people to drink too much alcohol or anything like that. And there was also this worry that producers might become too big and just take over the market and just pretty much rule the whole market, which would be bad for consumers. But what we tend to see is that this system actually is just very inefficient, because if you have to move wine from producers to distributors and then to retailers before it gets to you, every one of these people is adding value to this wine. They want to get paid for their service. So as a consumer, you end up paying more than you could if you were just buying it straight from the producer, which is very inefficient. So there is a couple laws that Minnesota has that pretty much makes sure that this system stays intact, and it end up hurting producers and also consumers. So the first one is the Sarli law. So this law was put in place in 2011. So before this law was put in place, breweries could not sell directly to consumers. They wouldn't sell pints of beer like the big breweries. So this law was pretty much a middle ground between the Minnesota Licensed Beverage Association and breweries. So they ended up going to court, and they did put this law in place, which basically allows breweries who brew less than 250,000 barrels of beer to sell to consumers on site in these like small cups, I guess, in pints of beer. So this was definitely a movement in the right direction, but they could do better by upping this limit. In Minnesota, we also have this law that limits grocery stores, especially, and also gas stations from only selling 3.2% beer. So for anybody who has been anywhere out of state and tried to buy alcohol in other states, you definitely can do that. I moved here from Alabama, so I used to buy wine in Walmart. So I was very surprised when I came here and I couldn't get wine at Walmart, and later found out, oh, it's just the Minnesota law that doesn't allow grocery stores to sell any kind of liquor apart from this beer. So this is there just to basically make sure that grocery stores don't compete with retailers. The same way that we have.
This is a really good example, I think. Why do we have these restrictions? Well, the answer is because the liquor store lobby is very strong, right? I mean, everything we're talking about here is the liquor store lobby trying to prevent competition from grocery stores, from breweries on site, and so forth, right?
Yes, definitely. There have been a couple of changes that they've lobbied against, especially the one raising the cap with the Charlie law to make sure more breweries can sell to more customers. But they've been against most of those changes just because they don't want to face unfair competition, they say, from producers. So in the same way, micro distilleries in Minnesota are also limited to only producing 40,000 gallons of beer. So if they pass that cap, they have to actually stop selling. They have to close their tap rooms. Something which is also just to make sure they don't compete in the market. And the big one is the growler cap. So this is for craft breweries. So Minnesota basically doesn't allow any craft brewers who brew more than 20,000 barrels of beer to sell growlers. So once once brewers reach that limit, they have to actually stop selling these growlers, or they have to move to like another production site. So I have a video here showing how what some brewers have been affected by this limit, because they had to either think of cutting staff or just really lessening their production.
At Lift Bridge Brewing in Stillwater.
This is our cold water tank, so that's used for the brewing process.
Co-founder Dan Schwartz oversees the growing business.
So we're actually at the point where we need to build a new brewery.
So you might be surprised to hear him say this.
You know, we may have to make some decisions on whether we're going to slow production down a little bit to stay under the cap, or...
That cap is Minnesota law. Once a brewery produces 20,000 barrels of beer a year, they can no longer sell beer off sale. Lift Bridge will hit it soon.
Certainly within the next year, we would be running up against the cap.
It'll be a big blow to us.
Mandy Larson is co-owner of Castle Danger Brewery in Two Harbors. She says growlers make up about 30% of their taproom sales, but since they hit the 20,000 barrel cap, they'll have to stop selling them when their license renews October 1st.
You know, that lost revenue means that we'll have to make some tough staffing decisions.
The cap is in place to essentially keep the breweries from competing with liquor stores. The Minnesota Licensed Beverage Association, in a statement, said in part, growler regulations do not need to be changed to accommodate already thriving businesses who want additional advantages over other smaller businesses. A bill at Lift Bridge Brewery.
Yeah, so yeah, basically the video there pretty much explains, sums it all. We have all these laws because retailers are trying not to get competition from producers. Even they deem it unfair competition, even though that's really not the case. So on occupational licensing, so Minnesota as a state, we're in a pretty good shape on this one. It's Minnesota is one of the lightly regulated states as far as occupational licensing is concerned. So with occupational licensing, there's basically two issues that will come about. It's either you are licensing occupations that don't need to be licensed. For instance, dental assistants. In Minnesota, we do license dental assistants when most states don't do that. Or we can either license occupations that definitely need to be licensed, but our restrictions are so hard that we end up raising the cost for these people to operate. So a good example of this is nursing. So Minnesota is one of the states that don't allow nurses to be in the nurse licensure compact. So this is basically a national compact that pretty much allows nurses who live in states whose states are in that compact to pretty much work in their home state, but also operate in other states that are also in the compact. So Minnesota is not in that compact, which means that if any nurse in Minnesota wants to work in another state, they have to get licensed in that other states, which basically transmits to higher costs for everybody that is trying to move or operate, like maybe remotely in other states. And another thing about Minnesota licenses that our burden has been growing. That means we're licensing more occupations, or we're raising the requirements for these occupations to be licensed. So here is a graph also by the McKinney Center. It's pretty much showing that compared to all these states, we're growing at number 12 in how much we're licensing our occupations, which is not a very good position to be. Our aim would have to be at the bottom there, at least be one of those states that are moving in the opposite direction, that are making it much easier for people to get to work in their states.
You know, Martha, it's kind of ironic. We think of Minnesota as a state that's pretty heavily regulated. Here's an example of where we were actually doing really well. We were one of the less regulated states in the country in terms of occupational licensing. Unfortunately, it seems like our legislature is trying to fix that by making us one of the more heavily regulated states, licensed states. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is pretty unfortunate. We're in a pretty good position as far as we are right now, but this growth is pretty worrisome. We do not want to be the state that is making it harder for people to work. So I have here a few examples of some of the occupations that are very stringently licensed in this state. So dental assistants. So most states usually don't license dental assistants, and the ones that do, they are not as strict as we are here in Minnesota. So on average, in other states, people usually pay like $130 in fees. They have to have like 2,000 hours of experience. They take one exam, but if you come to Minnesota, you have to pay at least $600 in fees. You have to take 3 exams, and you have to have 3,500 hours of experience, which is a pretty huge difference just to be and a pretty huge cost just to be a dental assistant, which is why it might be reasonable for some people to just not try to be a dental assistant at all. And for barbers and cosmetologists, these ones have the same requirements. They basically have to have 1,500 hours of experience, and they have to take an exam, which the Minnesota Barber and Cosmetologist Association is the one that gives these exams. So that's what it takes to be a barber and cosmetologist in Minnesota. But the crazy thing about this is that if you're a barber who's trying to transition to being a cosmetologist, you also have to take the other 1,500 hours, which are required to be a cosmetologist. There's no leeway here that goes to say, oh, maybe you took a few hours of being a barber, some of which are very similar to the kind of classes you take as with being a cosmetologist. They'll always require you to take the full number of classes. And for electricians in Minnesota, you have to have 8,000 hours of experience. I think, I'm not an expert, but I think some of these hours of experience can probably be pushed down a little bit just to make sure somebody has, as far as somebody has the necessary experience, they can definitely do some of these jobs, especially being a barber or cosmetologist. So housing is one also of the biggest issues we have in Minnesota. So we have, there's a webinar next week by Jeff Johnson, which is gonna talk more about this, but just to touch base, in Minnesota, we have a problem with the shortage of affordable housing. We have one of the highest housing prices, especially in the Twin Cities. And we also have rising rates of homelessness. So the big thing about housing is that it's very expensive to build in Minnesota. If you compare the building in Elk River and Hudson, Wisconsin, which is just like a river across away, the cost of building in Minnesota is at least $40,000 higher than building in Wisconsin. This is because of all the permits you have to take, the high cost of land because of these zoning laws. And additionally, in Minnesota, there is a mandate that pretty much requires rental housing property developers to set aside 10% of their apartments for affordable housing, which is definitely not profitable. It doesn't incentivize private companies to increase the supply of houses. So this is a graph showing the cost of median value of new homes in 2014 for different metropolitan areas. So Minnesota here is one of the, Minneapolis and St. Paul is one of the highest ones. And this is even crazier when you compare Minneapolis to the areas surrounding big cities. Our prices are way up compared to most of these places. For the other places like San Francisco, it makes sense that their prices are high because they have a lot of issues with like housing density. There's a lot more people moving in those cities, so they are bound to have a shortage of housing. But in Minnesota, we don't have as much people moving in here, so we should not be having shortage of affordable housing. Most of these issues are just because
there's no good reason, Martha, why housing in the Twin Cities should be so much more expensive than places like Milwaukee and Chicago. This is just kind of a teaser, folks, because next Wednesday, Jeff Johnson is going to be doing the presentation, and it's going to be all about expensive housing in the Twin Cities, which he's written a paper on for the center. It's also the cover story in the current issue of Thinking Minnesota.
Yes, so yeah, definitely there should not be any reason that our prices should be that high. So minimum wage is also one of the biggest issues with regulation. So in Minnesota, I think we have our minimum wage is just a little bit higher than the federal minimum wage. So we have, for big businesses, the minimum wage is $10, and for smaller businesses, the minimum wage is $8.15. But the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, they enacted this law last year whereby they're going to gradually phase the minimum wage to $15 by 2024. for Minneapolis and 2027 for St. Paul. So after these laws were enacted, we saw a lot of things actually happen in the cities. We saw a couple of restaurants going out of businesses because these are usually the most heavily affected businesses because they don't have that much cash on hand. So when you raise their cost, it makes it much harder for them to stay in business. And we see this loss of employment. This is especially this happened much more common with unskilled workers, which is pretty much unfair to them. Because one, they don't have as much skills as compared to people that maybe went to college and most of these minimum wage workers are unskilled workers. They are not as productive as other workers in the economy. They're not as educated for the most part. So most of the value that they can create is very proportionate with the wages they're earning, but minimum wage pretty much just outlawed employing these workers. So people ended up going out.
Martha, this is, a lot of people don't understand the minimum wage. A lot of people think, well, it would be nice if everybody made at least $15 an hour. So let's make that a law, right? But what the law really means is that if you're a person who, because of your youth, your level of skill, you're only able to create $12 an hour worth of value for an employer, for a company, it's illegal to hire you. You may want to work for $12 an hour. It may be that you could get a job for $12 an hour, but it's now illegal to hire you. And so what we're doing is forcing people to be unemployed who are in that category. It's really a very cruel and unfair thing to do, I think.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, because a lot of people seem to not realize that most of the minimum wage workers most of them are highly unskilled. So most of these wages they correspond to their level of skill and how much production they're doing. I think one of the biggest issue with the minimum wage is because there's all these ideas floating around that big businesses just want to take advantage of workers. That's most usually not the case. Wages are usually growing, especially for skilled workers. So one of the things that could help unskilled workers more is for them to get skills instead of forcing companies to go out of business. Is just to pay people higher than what they could afford, which is usually what we see. There's a picture here of a place in St. Paul last year. It's called O'Gara's. So this was a bar and grill in St. Paul that's been in business since 1941. So it's been there for at least 70 years, and it just went out of business last year, basically because the owners of this place could not foresee themselves staying in businesses while paying $15 minimum wage. So they pretty much had other things going for them. A lot of restaurants do have high healthcare costs. They do have increasing operation costs, like food going higher. So when you add on minimum wage to them, it just really it just kind of messes up their bottom line. So it's not just the minimum wage itself, just the fact that smaller businesses have other issues they're dealing with. The minimum wage kind of pushes them over the edge. So that's why you have a lot of small establishments going out of business. In this age of coronavirus, I think we've seen a very interesting trend with our regulation. We've seen a lot of states just realizing that most of the regulations that they put in place are really just there to put burden on businesses. So we've seen a lot of states just kind of repeal some laws. They've made these temporary suspensions just to make sure that businesses are able to provide services and goods to people. So we hope that most of these laws stay permanent, but it is going to depend on legislatures that taking that effort. So I'm going to talk about a couple of places here where we've seen a lot of some changes with states. So the first one is childcare. So childcare is one of the biggest issues facing this state, especially, in just the whole nation. So we have a lot of shortage with childcare. We have states facing high childcare prices, something which can be solved by loosening our regulations. But most states haven't done that. But with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of states just pretty much try to make it easier for providers to stay, because they were trying to make sure essential workers get to have services. So Missouri took an effort to pretty much loosen paperwork requirements for providers. Other states made provisions, just making sure that if any providers were going out of business just because of burdensome regulations, they were going to put a suspension to all those laws, make sure providers stay. We had states introducing these short-term licenses that could go up to like just 45 days for anybody that wanted them. I'm pretty sure if you had some of these laws during normal times, you wouldn't be facing some of these issues that we do face on a daily basis, like shortage and high prices. Most of these issues are there just because we're increasing costs for our providers of childcare. The other thing we've seen is with alcohol licensing, liquor licensing. So in Minnesota, actually, just beginning last Saturday, you can order alcohol from a restaurant with your meal. So you can take it to go, something which you can usually do on normal days. Other states have actually authorized alcohol selling places to do deliveries even. Good news also with telemedicine. We've seen states allowing people in their state to access medical services from other providers, either remotely. Remotely. So in the state of Minnesota, a couple of weeks ago, the governor put out this executive order, which pretty much made it possible for mental health care patients to access services from providers from out of state remotely. So the state of Minnesota, as of right now, is recognizing licenses from mental health care providers as if they were licensed in the state, something which if we were to enact it during normal periods of time, it could make our health system much more efficient and just really free up services to people. And we've seen, this is one of the biggest ones. A lot of states were actually worried that they were not going to have, be able to meet the capacity of like patients in their healthcare. So we saw a lot of states repealing their certificate of need laws. So these are there just basically to make sure that hospitals are not expanding necessarily. So certificate of need laws just make it a requirement for hospitals to get permission before they expand their capacity or before they add like a number of beds or like build a new hospital. Most of the argument there is that, well, hospitals are going to have this incentive to just add number of beds just unnecessarily, just so they could increase costs on customers, or like hospitals are going to build new facilities when even there's no need, which is very illogical because hospitals are business places. So they're going to make sure that they are building capacity where it's needed. I think we've seen with a lot of research has pretty much shown that the states that have these laws don't exactly have lower prices as they're intended. Their prices are actually much higher for some services.
Hey Martha, let me just stop you for a second here to make sure our viewers understand this, because I didn't know about this until the whole coronavirus epidemic came along. But it has been, for decades, it has been illegal in the state of Minnesota to build a new hospital or to expand an existing hospital unless you had specific legislation from the Minnesota legislature allowing you to do it. That just blows my mind. And then we have an epidemic and all of a sudden they're saying, oh no, we're not going to have enough hospital beds. Well, that didn't actually happen. But you know, it's just crazy to make it illegal for hospitals to expand without permission from the legislature. So that's a good example of the kind of a thing where now that people understand that law is in place, let's just repeal it. I mean, it's crazy.
Yes, there's definitely no need for this law because, yeah, a lot of research has shown that states that do have this law, they actually don't have lower prices, as I've mentioned. And most times they do have like maybe higher mortality rates for some services compared to states that don't have this law. So this law sometimes tend to do harm, as research has shown. So even though most people don't realize that it's there, because it's there, still it's affecting hospitals from expanding their services, and from sometimes it also affects them in making innovations or like investing in more expensive technologies. So the other big thing that happened was with medical licensing. We saw a lot of states also making sure that medical providers who were licensed in other states would be able to work in their states without requiring extra licensing. So usually states require extra licensing if somebody was licensed in a state that is not theirs, which also does not make sense, because I don't believe there's any state that is particularly worse at licensing doctors or like nurses. I do believe most of the standards are pretty much the same. So there's really no need for doctors to be taking extra, paying extra costs just to work in another state. Yeah, so we saw Colorado. Colorado was one of the first states to do this, to allow medical providers to work in their state. The other thing was also seen was the trucking and delivery industry. So some states do have these laws that pretty much prevent trucks that deliver alcohol from delivering to grocery stores. So I don't know the reasoning there, but I'm guessing it's just also, as many other laws, it's just to prevent competition basically. So what we saw in Texas was that because groceries were running low, they started authorizing these trucks that usually deliver for alcohol places to start delivering for grocery stores. So I'm pretty sure if most of these laws were enacted just during normal times, we wouldn't have much of this scarcity we do have with some of these services. I think most of our services would pretty much be more efficient even. But yeah, I hope most of these laws will be made permanent, but we're not sure of that for most of these states. So why do we tend to see most of these burdensome regulation? There's a couple of reasons for that. Most of the reason is because of how our system is set up. It allows for people to do rent seeking. So rent seeking is it's also known as lobbying sometimes. So this is why a group of people, maybe established companies, go to legislatures and they do convince them to put on this law that is there to protect customers, when in essence it's not there to do that. So a good example of this is for anybody who watches South Park, there's this episode whereby there's this character, Randy Marsh, who grows marijuana in South Park. So he calls his farm Integrity Farms. So this huge farm. So people in South Park started growing their own marijuana, like in the house. So Randy Marsh was losing business. But instead of like maybe trying to lower his prices, or maybe do some sort of buy one, get one free promotions, he went to the city council and tried to get them to ban people from growing their own marijuana. So basically his reasoning was that, well, if you allow people to grow their own marijuana, they might they might grow it wrong and poison themselves, or they might use cheap irrigation and basically drown babies. Some of the craziest things, which have like a very tiny possibility of happening, but that's pretty much the same thing that happens with most of these regulations. Last year, we had the Minnesota Board of Cosmetologists ban freelance makeup artists from performing, doing work at weddings. Basically, the argument there was you need to do more training, you need to have more hours just to do makeup on-site weddings, which also doesn't make sense because you have been doing the same work, you've been having business, so there's no need really for you to get extra training just to do your job at weddings. But this is what we tend to see with rent seeking there. And the other thing is people want to seem, especially politicians, they do want to seem like they have good intentions, so they tend to enact all these laws that basically look good and sound good. For instance, minimum wage, this is one of the laws that hurt small businesses, but we tend to see this law being enacted a lot, especially now, because people want to drive down the idea that they're caring for other people, they're caring for the little guy. So most of these laws, because they're there just to reach out to our humanity, they tend not to be scrutinized a lot when they're suggested. So people tend to pass them just on how good they sound instead of how economically feasible they are. And the other thing that leads to burdensome regulation is there's a lot of advocacy that goes on, especially with laws that do sound good, like minimum wage. You have a lot of groups just going around protesting in the streets. You have a lot of groups just going around online, maybe like support this bill, is going to raise wages for people. So yeah, with advocacy also, you also have a lot of people that don't tend to scrutinize all these suggestions, all these laws. So they also do tend to pass them based on how good they sound as well. And one of the other factors can be that sometimes negative effects of some laws can be transitory. That means they don't last as long. So people tend to feel like those effects didn't happen, or they were not as deep as some people warned about. For instance, minimum wage. If you raise the minimum wage, you have a couple of businesses go out of work. You have some businesses cut hours. In the long run, businesses are going to learn to restructure, maybe to cut costs, just to make sure they stay in businesses. So when they do that, it makes it seem like some of those effects didn't happen, or even though they happened, they were just not as big as maybe people preach. So it makes it much easier for people to pass these laws the next time it's suggested, because those effects have just kind of passed on. People have restructured, people have learned to work around them, pretty much so. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time.
So we have just a few minutes for questions. If you have a question that you didn't type in yet, go ahead and type it in now. I want to ask you, Martha, about a comment that one of our viewers made just a couple of minutes ago, and that is that minimum wage laws can involve rent seeking. We think of them as being kind of well-intentioned but misguided, but actually there's more to it than that. And as this viewer points out, union labor contracts are sometimes based on a multiple of the minimum wage, and that's true. And so every time they raise the minimum wage, there's a certain number of union workers who will automatically get a pay increase. So even though it may cause more unemployment to people who are less skilled, there are actually people who are benefiting it. So can you comment on that, Martha? Just one more example of rent seeking.
Well, I think there's I don't have a specific example of people rent seeking for the minimum wage, but I think there's definitely an incentive for big businesses to have these kinds of law passed. So some huge businesses like maybe Amazon or Walmart, they might raise their wages and publicize this a lot. I think they tend to make it a point that we are caring for our workers, and so should everybody else, which pretty much tends to build pressure on small businesses and on like legislature to make sure to pass this law to every little business, when those huge companies know that when this law passes, they're going to be the ones to benefit, even though they can afford to, they know they can definitely afford those costs, which is why they tend to push down this idea that everybody should be paying the minimum wage, should be paying higher. So there's definitely an incentive there for big businesses to push for these ideas, even though sometimes may not be like direct lobbying. They might just publicize their actions very much so that people feel like everybody else has to do this.
You know, Martha, one of the things that you can lose sight of when we talk about the negative effects of over-regulation or poorly designed regulation, there's a lot of people who benefit from having lots of regulations that are hard to figure out. I was a lawyer for 41 years, and believe me, lawyers love it when the federal government or the state government adopts a whole new set of regulations, because people have to pay them to try to figure those regulations out and advise them on how to comply with them. There are whole industries that are built around helping people to comply with regulations. And the more irrational the regulations are and the more burdensome the regulations are, the more those industries actually benefit. It's kind of ironic. And one of our viewers comments, the most blatant example of rent seeking I've seen was when H&R Block, the people that get paid to fill out tax returns, lobbied Congress to make tax law more complicated during the Obama years, and later opposed the tax simplification that was passed in 2017. I think that's a great example of the fact that even though excessive regulation hurts us all in various ways, there are actually some people who really profit from it.
Yes, definitely. That's definitely true. Yeah, that's a very good example with the tax code. There's definitely a lot of people that do work on the tax code. There's a TurboTax here, so I would imagine they would want the tax code to say as complicated as it is, So they definitely do invest some time and money just making sure it stays like that. Yeah.
I think it is it 1 o'clock? It is exactly 1 o'clock, and we try to keep these sessions to an hour. So I think we'll call it quits there for today. Thank you all very much for attending. Hope you've enjoyed this webinar. Thank you, Martha. And we're going to be back with the last in this masterclass series next Wednesday. We moved it from Wednesday to Thursday this week, but next week we'll be back on the Wednesday schedule. And next week we're going to hear Jeff Johnson, twice the Republican nominee for governor of Minnesota, who's going to be talking about the high cost of housing in Minnesota, particularly in the Twin Cities. He has written a paper on this for Center of the American Experiment that's going to be published sometime in the next week or two. And in the meantime, he's written the cover story in the current issue of Thinking Minnesota, our magazine, and it's on the high cost of housing in Minnesota and the ways in which poor and excessive regulations in Minnesota imposed by the Metropolitan Council, among other agencies, are responsible for the excessive cost of housing in the Twin Cities. So I encourage all of you to tune in next Wednesday to hear Jeff Johnson talk about the effects of poor regulation on housing in Minnesota. So with that, we'll call it quits for today. Thanks again to Martha, and thanks to all of you for tuning in.
All right, thank you.